sources of knowledge and the way that they interact within the policy process. So initial thinking on the linkages between knowledge and policy really focused on the contribution of science and research. But empirical studies have shown that policymakers' tastes are actually much more eclectic than that. A wide range of information sources can shape policy and practice, from community voices to moral principles and judgments, impact assessments, systematic reviews of existing evidence, and project and program knowledge. And we argue that by focusing on the source of influence for policy decisions, then we can explore more carefully the different ways in which power is embedded in the decision-making process, including through the use of particular discourses or framing of issues, and challenging taken-for-granted assumptions and descriptions. So in other words, the way we think about power is not just the use of overt force or power over other actors, but that it can also be exercised through the types of frameworks we provide others to think about a particular set of problems, and also influencing the set of values they hold. So in order to counter the power of a particular set of actors active around a specific policy problem, we argue that it's really important to promote the triangulation of multiple sources of knowledge and policy dialogues. So work by Calsil, for example, in 2008, has highlighted the way in which slow progress of the good governance agenda owes to Western institutions and approaches sitting uncomfortably with certain traditions, core ideas and values in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. Similarly, as the work by the African Power and Politics Program at ODI has underscored, development practitioners have to learn to go with the grain of deeply entrenched ideas around power, accountability, and social morality. And as we highlight in our publication, a similar approach has been undertaken by one of ODI's Indonesian partners, Semeru, and their work around social safety nets. And here, in order to influence discussions on a national poverty alleviation program targeting about 16 million poor households, Semeru drew on in-depth interviews and focus group discussions with participants and non-participants at the grassroots level, as well as combining this with sophisticated econometric data using government, but also importantly, independent data sets to bring in these multiple voices to the policy debate. The second key area we look at is that of political context. And there's a wide body of evidence that highlights that political context is really one of the most influential factors in determining the importance attached to evidence or knowledge in a policy space. However, what we've really struggled with is that identifying patterns about the knowledge policy interface in different contexts is much more challenging than we'd anticipated. So the questions we've been asking are, which states are more conducive to evidence-informed policy processes? Democracies, developmental one-party states such as Vietnam, for instance, or post-conflict societies where the thirst for the new is often particularly intense? And what about the levels of authority? Are international and regional fora more likely to listen to new knowledge than national or subnational governments? And why is this? So our preliminary conclusion is that political liberalization and democratization has opened up opportunities for the representation of more viewpoints and different sources of knowledge in the policy process. So for instance, we just have to think about the proliferation of think tanks and research institutes in countries from Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa since the wave of democratic transitions in the 1980s and 1990s. But also in more centralized political systems such as China and Vietnam. However, the extent to which these new spaces allow for the new voices to actually shape decision-making remains unclear. So for instance, while the poverty reduction strategy processes with which I'm sure many of you are familiar have opened up formal consultation spaces for a range of stakeholders to submit their views and different sorts of evidence, there's considerable skepticism amongst many analysts about the extent to which these views ultimately shape the content of these PRSPs. And in terms of effective entry points for influence, an international survey that we at ODI undertook last year with SciDevNet, with over 600 researchers, policymakers, and intermediary organizations, suggested that although in general the research literacy levels of subnational government officers may be lower than that of their national counterparts, in fact they're more eager to engage closely with knowledge producers as they're not facing the same type of information overload that many national level authorities are increasingly encountering. And then our final point here is that although most of the research on the knowledge policy interface to date has focused on democratic contexts, whether in the developed or the developing world, more recent work that we've been involved in with EDPDNs, or our Evidence-Based Development and Policy Network partners, and the UNDP Governance Centre in Oslo, suggests that there are often unexpected windows of opportunity in fragile or post-conflict states. And so Naya is going to share some of his insights based on the experience in Nepal, but also our work on Serbia, for instance, has highlighted that because of strong national motivations to enter the European Union and comply with accession criteria, that there's a growing appetite for new knowledge on government reform issues. The next issue we look at is that of sectoral dynamics. And here I want to emphasize that although we talk a lot about the importance of political contexts, surprisingly there's been little systematic discussion about the ways in which knowledge and policy actors interact around different policy issues or sectors. But emerging research suggests that the dynamics of policy dialogues and the types of knowledge privileged within these differ markedly across sectors, whether it's trade versus education or natural resource management. And in our own research, we've identified 4 key dimensions along which the knowledge policy interface characteristics may differ. So the first is technical expertise. And here we argue that as the complexity of debates in a given sector increase, demands for technical know-how may generate hierarchies of knowledge, exclusionary barriers, and even a depoliticization of debates. So for instance, in the case of trade policy, debates have become increasingly technical and dominated by economists and to a lesser extent lawyers, such that civil society of actors have found it increasingly difficult to influence the terms of the debate. The second characteristic we consider is that the role of economic interests. So in sectors with strong private sector interests, entry points for participatory knowledge may be more limited. Sticking with the trade policy example, our work with partners on the Coppola project on trade and poverty in Latin America has highlighted that it's often very challenging to gain the same type of attention in the eyes of key policy decision makers as that of private sector actors, and that a strategic policy engagement is required over a sustained period of time in order for alternative perspectives to be listened to. So for instance, in the case of Peru, our partners, CS, use the insights they gain from a meeting with the minister to take on board the ministry's priority knowledge demands and have sought to balance investment in their own research agenda with a more demand-led knowledge generation in order to establish an ongoing dialogue with key ministerial staff. The third issue is that of issue contestation. So research is more likely to be taken up if there's a consensus on the contours of the problem being addressed. So for instance, if we think about research on reproductive health issues, research is often dismissed in this area as it's highly contested and value-driven, and moral arguments rather than quality evidence tend to carry greater weight in many political contexts. The final characteristic we look at is that of the internationalization of debates. And here we've found that domestic actors often enjoy greater success in influencing policy if they have linkages to international actors and discourses. So for instance, work by Keck and Sinkink has highlighted the way in which domestic actors working in the areas of environmental protection, gender equality, and HIV/AIDS have often enjoyed greater success in influencing policy once they've established working relationships with international actors. The next chapter then turns to look at the role of different actors at the knowledge policy interface. And what we emphasize is that much analysis has already been done on a triad of actors operating in this arena, so namely bureaucrats, donors, and researchers. However, given the proliferation of actors involved in the policy process now in many contexts, we argue that it's critical that we consider both other types of policy decision makers, such as legislators, as well as a broad spectrum of civil society actors, so traditional leaders, think tanks, or networks, for instance. Think tanks, we find, are increasingly influential players, as the recent interest by donors highlights. So, for instance, the Hewlett Foundation has now allocated $100 million for its think tank program in Africa and South Asia over the next 10 years. But think tanks often face key challenges in balancing independence versus political impact. So, for instance, some of our new research with partners in Latin America highlights that think tanks in that region are often affiliated with particular political parties. So while this may be conducive to political influence, the potential trade-offs in terms of credibility over the long term are high, especially as their parties' political fortunes ebb and flow. Another key actor to think about is obviously networks, which are becoming increasingly important for development policy research. Communities of practice, for instance, can play a key role in promoting information flows and knowledge sharing and augmenting members' voices in policy debates. So a good example here is a network coordinated by the Philippines Institute of Development Studies, which collates research sources from different organizations in order to inform debates on social and economic policy bills going through Congress in a timely and systematic manner. And then the final set of actors we've spent some time looking at are legislators, who have largely been invisible in the knowledge economy to date. But our recent research with partners in East Africa and Southeast Asia shows that it's gradually starting to change. Given the role of legislators in ensuring oversight of the bureaucracy's implementation record, the potential to use research and evaluation to considerable impact is high. So NGOs in Tanzania are recognizing this, for example, and now hold regular forums and training workshops in the political capital of Dodoma to raise awareness about their policy research findings, as well as new knowledge emerging from projects and programs. Next, we turn to innovative frameworks. And here, I think it's important to emphasize from the outset that the original RAPID framework was built upon insights from a range of different theories and perspectives. And so we're continuing to explore the relevance of new frameworks and then innovative applications of existing frameworks. One key area we've been looking at is complexity theory. So complexity theory is the study of interdependent, dynamic living systems and draws on work from a range of different disciplines, but which are increasingly being applied to the social sciences. And a key contribution of complexity theory to development is its emphasis on multidimensional, messy, and interconnected development problems, and the danger of relying on simplistic narratives or policy blueprints. To address this, some of the key recommendations from complexity theory highlight that feedback mechanisms need to be enhanced to promote flexibility, and that the integration of multiple sources of knowledge needs to be facilitated. Another framework we've explored together with the DFID-funded Research into Use program is that of innovation systems, which focus on the processes and drivers behind innovation and seeks to understand the dynamics of supply and demand for new knowledge. So a good example here that we highlight in the publication is work undertaken by CABI International with their Global Plant Clinic scheme, which they've established in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These clinics involve local plant doctors giving diagnoses and recommendations to farmers. So they're set up in marketplaces where many farmers congregate, and farmers are encouraged to bring samples of their problems. So the plant doctors are then trained in techniques about how to interview farmers and how to provide them with expert sources of technical support. So the plant doctors are really playing a brokering role between the users and suppliers of new knowledge to solve some of these key plant health issues that poor farmers are facing. And then the final chapter in the book looks at knowledge translation. And although a substantial body of development knowledge exists, we all know that much of it is not readily accessible to policy decision makers. And here, what we do is to draw on a definition by the Canadian Health Services Research Foundation of knowledge translation as a dynamic and iterative process that includes the synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge. And we've got a diagram here that tries to highlight some of these complex interactions and it tries to move away from a much more linear model of research to policy linkages. So the work that we do around knowledge translation focuses on packaging knowledge not only so it's more accessible to potential users, but also to facilitate the conditions for policy dialogue among key actors who would not normally communicate, and in particular, to promote the uptake of knowledge in a way that enhances positive developmental challenges. So a key component of knowledge translation involves capacity strengthening for researchers. And here a very good example of this is the work that our partners in Vietnam have been doing with the Economics Committee in the National Assembly. So working with them to better be able to utilize new forms of research, particularly as the National Assembly is gaining more of a voice in the political process and tackling some of the key economic challenges that the country is facing in the context of the global crisis. So in conclusion, where we end is that the RAPID framework provides a very useful analytical entry point, but that in order to develop effective tools for policy engagement, we need to be mindful of the extreme complexity that we face in the policy process, but also to be seeking to plug key gaps in our knowledge. And here I want to emphasize just a few key areas that we think are particularly pressing to fill in the coming years. So we argue that sharing experiences about trying to bridge research and policy is critical, but there's also a pressing need to systematize these insights so as to tease out lessons that will facilitate the development of more tailored approaches and tools. So some particular areas where work is needed are experiences across countries about working to influence legislators in their efforts to increase the balance of power between branches of government and better accountability. Experiences within countries, for instance, but involving different sectoral issues, so to better understand the challenges, similarities and differences from one sector to the next. Experiences of working with intermediaries, so agencies or people who can play an important brokering role with very different researcher and policy communities. And finally, experiences about how best to either work with or dismantle existing knowledge hierarchies around particular policy issues or sectors.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Nicola.